Today, I'm talking about the right hand of God. The right hand of God. Psalm 63:8. My soul followeth hard after thee. Thy right hand upholdeth me. My soul followeth hard after thee. Thy right hand upholdeth me. Psalm 139. I'm going to read the first 13 verses to the chief musician. Psalm of David. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my downsetting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou compasseth my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. And there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain unto it. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. For thou hast possessed my reins, and thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. This is basically saying, God, you've been with me the whole time. When I don't feel you, you're working, you're there. When I don't know you're there, when I don't see a sign of you being there, you're there. And oftentimes, and like this psalm, we're looking back. And when we look back, we can see the hand of God. Not so much in the present. The present is where we have question marks. And the present is where we are not sure about the prayer we prayed. Was it effective? Is God going to respond? Was I praying amiss? Was I aiming in the right place? But understand by and by. We understand it by and by. In other words, our tomorrows are waiting to reveal to us that God was there. And it's often in hindsight that we realize that God was there. And much of testimonies are simply about what we can now look back and see that God has done. God speaks of his strength and ability. His right hand is his strength and his ability. Peter, preaching in Acts 2, mentions Jesus sitting at God's right hand. And that means he's sitting in that place of power and authority. He said, therefore, being by the right hand of God exalted. We are blessed, really, to be partakers of God's mighty hand of power and blessing. We follow God, but eventually we're going to need his power. We're going to need strength. We're going to need something else in our life besides the current just path we're on, the current pace that we're going, the direction we're going. We're going to need something to turn us or to turn situations around. We can follow him, and we can do very well, and we can be living for God the best we know how. But there's going to be a point, there's going to be a day when we're going to need something else. We're going to need to be lifted. We're going to need to be pulled out. We're going to need to be protected. And that is when we need to depend on the hand of God in our life. We need to go from just agreeing that there is a God to actually experiencing his power in our life to where it's unmistakable that he's been there. We follow God. We do, but eventually we're going to need his power. Those who follow without experiencing the power, they will eventually fail from weakness. And we shouldn't be ashamed if our faith begins to waver a little bit, because it's been a while since we have seen God operating in our life. We shouldn't feel that we're anything but human. And those who follow without experiencing the power, at some point, if they never reach God's power, and it happens, all we have to do is stop praying. And in that place, because we're not living in a vacuum, but in that place where prayer begins to wane, there's going to be human effort, and we're going to try to do things our way. But that prayer area of our life is so very important to keep us connected in this faith walk, because we pray with faith believing. We worship with faith, believing. And so we follow God. And that's great to be following God, and it's necessary, but we are going to have to depend on the supernatural at some point very shortly in our journey. And those who follow and don't experience that power are going to fall. Those who say they follow but are weak in their relationship will soon realize their weakness. And, we need God's power each day of our life. We need the proof in our life that he's there. And I know it's a faith walk. We walk by faith, not by sight. But you're going to come through a season where you're going to need God to pick you up. And you're going to need that unmistakable hand of God that's going to move in and take care of you. Looking into scriptures, we easily see where God placed his hand in the lives of men, but we might miss the very important fact that God has his hand on us as well. If we're believing that God led Abraham, if he led Isaac, he led Jacob, then we need to understand his leading hasn't stopped. He is still able to lead people, and he's able to lead us. We learn about God by looking back at those who experienced God firsthand. Abraham was taken from Ur and told to go to a strange land and wait for a promise. And he did it by faith. And he died at 175 years old, full of blessings, full of promises that he could pass down to the generation coming up behind him. Jacob, he was taken back to where Abraham was from. But he reached his breaking point in that land where God had blessed him, working for his father-in-law, whom he said, "You changed my wages 10 times. And in the latter part of his time there, he began to be prosperous because God gave him prosperity at just the right time. See, if he was prosperous in his first 10 years, he might have left too early and it wouldn't have been time. But he had to learn how to trust God. He had to learn how to weather the storms of being a shepherd, as he said, in a wilderness. He said, in cold nights, in the heat of the desert, he goes, I was out here working to try to grow my flocks and my father-in-law's flocks. All of that time, not getting enough, not being able to have enough flocks and herds and basically wealth to go back home. He was bound to Laban until God was ready to bless him enough to where he could say, now it's time for me to go back home. He had to trust God, but God took him to a breaking point before he launched him, and he felt free to go back home. Think about Joseph. He was taken from Canaan, sold to slaves, went down into Egypt, and cried out to God. Worked for Potiphar. Potiphar's wife falsely accused him. He's put in a dungeon. But in that dungeon, he never stopped being who he was. His nature rose to the top, was able to interpret the dreams of the butler and the baker. And he told them in their dream, you're going to be brought back up. You're going to face the king. And the butler, you're going to be restored. The baker, you're not so much. But he told that butler, he goes, when you get there, remember me. And it wasn't until Pharaoh's dream that butler said, you know what? I've messed up. I should have told you about a young man that's falsely imprisoned. And God was able to launch Joseph in such a great way, a beautiful, beautiful story, that it was all a part of God's plan to bring his people into Egypt so they could grow from 70 to over 1 million to 2 million people in those years that they were there. Moses was raised in the palace, but he wouldn't be called the son. He wouldn't be called an Egyptian. No, he knew who his mother was. He knew who his sister was. And he said, I'm not going to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. In that stubbornness that he had, that allegiance that he maintained with his family, caused him to work his way out of the palace through trying to take up for his own people. And there he had to go to Midian for 40 years. But God gave him a wife. And then later, at the right time, the right hand of God was revealed to him. The strength of God. See, when we talk about God's strength and power, we're not just talking about the presence of the Lord. And we love the presence of the Lord. And we know he's around us all the time. And we love to feel the move of God in a church service. But when we talk about the right hand of God, that's the part of God that takes effect in your life and moves you. That's the hand of God that directs you. And when you're praying about the will of God, just picture that right hand being laid upon your shoulder and turning you to the left and to the right. His hand is definite. And if you depend on God and you invite God to be your guide, he will not allow you to make a mistake or turn in the wrong direction. And the one thing that all these men, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses, the one thing they all had in common was the hand of God took them to a breaking point, every one of them, before releasing them for their purpose. And so that right hand of God, it's the strength. It is that force that puts us where we need to be and keeps us there until it's time for release. And I don't want God to release me until it's time. I don't want God to move me until it's time. But when it's time, I have to depend on that right hand of power. That right hand is the unmistakable move of God in your life where you can say, I know he was there. And there's where you build your monument. There's where you say, I'm never moving from that. I'm going to stand on this. That was God moving. And that's your testimony. And that's how you encourage others, is by you telling them about that. Kind of like an arrow that's drawn from the bow and it gets to its apex. It's drawn to its fullest strength. And right when it's drawn to that full strength, that arrow is released. The hand of God can feel tight sometimes. Right before release, it can feel like stress. It might feel like loneliness. It may feel like confusion, fear perhaps, and many other emotions. But the result is a higher purpose of God. The tension right before release can often be expressed in us as frustration. I don't know if I can take it anymore. I'm ready to turn in. I'm ready to give up. But just hang on. Because right at that moment, God's about to release with his power. Abraham said, Lord, just let Ishmael live before you. Because, really, we're too old. I appreciate the chance. And it was right at that point where Abraham said, I don't know what to do. He listened to his wife. She goes, here, you know what? We can have a child by my nursemaid. And there's Ishmael. And now Abraham is saying, God, look at Ishmael. I'm okay if you want to do it with him. And the Lord said, no, I'm not going to build a kingdom through the son of the bondwoman. I'll bless him and I'll bless her, but you're going to have a child. And Joseph, when he got to the breaking point, he said, remember me when you're restored. Please don't forget about me. And Moses spent 40 years watching sheep and wondering if he missed his chance. Then he saw a bush burning. Then he saw fire. And that fire was the hand of God telling him, all right, now it's time. 2 Kings, I really like this reading. I use it a lot. I refer back to it often. Chapter 13 and verse 14 through 17. Now Elisha was fallen sick of his sickness whereof he died. And Joash, the king of Israel, came down unto him and wept over his face and said, oh, my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. And Elisha said to him, take bow and arrows. And he took unto him bow and arrows. And he said unto the king of Israel, put thine hand upon the bow. And he put his hand upon it. And Elisha put his hands upon the king's hands. He didn't leave him there, but he put him on there, as if to signify anointing. You are anointed. And he said, open the window eastward, and he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot, and he shot. And he said, the arrow of the Lord's deliverance and the arrow of deliverance from Syria. For thou shalt smite the Syrians in Aphek till you have consumed them. Whenever he told him to smite the ground with the arrows, the Bible said he smite the ground 3 times and stopped. The power was there. The promise was there. The arrow was shot. And he said, see that arrow? That's the arrow of the Lord's deliverance. But when it was time for the king, Joash, to smite the ground, to do what he needed to do in his obedience, he was left with an option: smite the ground. And instead of being vigorous about it, he seemed a little hesitant, as if to say, what does this have to do with that? And it had everything to do with it. What are you willing to do? And sometimes what we see in a church service is people doing what they're willing to do in their worship. It doesn't look like somebody sitting down with hands folded in front of their face as if a child was praying. But we worship in a way that Joash should have smote the ground. We're worshiping in a way that we're giving God everything. And he rewards us for that. He said, you should have smitten the ground. You should have continued to hit the ground with those arrows. He goes, but now you're going to defeat your enemy 3 times. But you could have defeated him. You could have smitten him enough times to defeat him. When we feel like we can't take it anymore, we're at the breaking point. It might be that God has you drawn back with his bow, and that bowstring is taut. When you're right there at that point of tension, like, I don't know if I can take it, it's possible that you're about to be released. God released Abraham into fatherhood and later up to Mount Moriah, where he caught a glimpse of Christ in the form of a sacrificial ram. Jacob was tired of his father-in-law changing his wages 10 times. He said, I'm not going to stand for this. And he was tired of the fear of his brother. And he said, I'm not letting go until I get blessed. When he wrestled with God, it was then that God released him to be the man who had power with God. A prince, thou hast power with God. That's what some of us are waiting for right now, is we're wrestling. But don't turn loose. Don't stop the process until God's through with you. Joseph was, drawn into a dungeon before God released him. And then think about Queen Esther, Mordecai, the 3 Hebrews, and Daniel. All of them pushed to the extreme, and God showed up. He always does. He always does. All people that God held back with his strong right hand until it was time for his divine purpose to be shown in their life. God's hand in your life doesn't always feel like power or even his presence. But when he releases you, when that time comes, it's going to be because you endured, you kept praying, you kept believing, knowing that God was going to come through. Darkness may endure for a night, but remember, joy comes in the morning. So good morning to you. God bless each and every one of you. Have a great day.